So this is Teaching Students in Poverty, and I'm with Seeds of Literacy. We're an adult education agency in Cleveland, Ohio, and we provide one-to-one instruction for adult learners, whether they're beginning readers or whether they have a high school diploma and they're trying to just improve their skills. So we serve all students. And so what I'd like for you all to do initially is just think about the things, think about the things that we learn about people in poverty. Think about the things that you've heard about people in poverty, people who are experiencing poverty. And if you don't mind just sharing in the chat, what are some of the things that you think, what are some of the myths, some of the things that exist around folks who live in poverty? What are some of the things that we believe about folks who are living in poverty, folks who are experiencing poverty? What are some of the beliefs or myths, if you don't mind sharing? And these don't have to be things that you think or believe, but things that you've heard. So I see low academic skills, tremendous barriers, bootstraps. That's probably one of my favorites. I say that tongue in cheek. I hate to hear people say that. Yes, they're lazy. They bring it on themselves. They're not hardworking. They just need to be taught to budget, that they're self-defeating. So yeah, all of these myths exist. We've all heard them at one time or another. And so part of what we're going to do today is try to counter some of the myths that we've heard about folks who are experiencing poverty. All right. So one of the things, oh, I'm sorry, before I go to that slide, let me just say, one of the things that I feel is really important, especially in the field of adult literacy, is that, you know, often folks who come into adult literacy aren't coming from having a professional background in education. Sometimes we all end up in positions because we just happen to be the right person at the right place at the right time. And I think that sometimes it makes it a little bit more important for us to get professional development around the topics that are really important to folks who we might not have had a lot of experience around prior to coming into adult literacy. So I really want to focus on what some of those myths are. Some folks say that they're self-defeating, that they need to try harder, all of those things that we've heard. We're going to try to debunk some of those today. All right. So let me just ask too, do you believe the messages to be true? Do you believe the things that you hear? And where do these messages come from? Where do we hear these messages about folks who are living in poverty? So I see one person who says, no, I don't believe it. Most definitely not. So what's true is that most of what we learn about poverty, most of what we learn about people who are in poverty. And I'm going to mute everyone so you don't have so much background noise. Most of what we hear about people in poverty, we learn from the media, and the media tends to over-exaggerate, over-generalize, and sensationalize. So we're not necessarily getting true facts. So what ends up happening is the programs and the policies and the procedures that folks who don't have a lot of experience with poverty end up creating can sometimes be disrespectful or even harmful to folks who are experiencing poverty. So I'm going to go to this next slide. And this is an example of the deficit mentality that a lot of folks who work with people experiencing poverty will see. So they think of them in a deficit model. They think of them as a problem to solve or something that needs to be fixed. And it can be reflected in your program practices quite easily. So if you'll look at these rules with me, I'll read a couple of them because I just think that they're a very good example of that deficit mentality. So first, 91% attendance is mandatory over the course of the year. You must speak English in class at all times. If you must miss class because you or your child gets sick or there's a family emergency, you need to call us or text us to let us know. When you call or text, leave a voicemail in English, underlined, say your name, class level, the reason for your absence, and when you return. It is the student's responsibility to call the program. Please schedule your doctor's appointments. We won't even talk about the spelling and grammar before or after class. All students are required to have voicemail set up on their phone, so learn how to use it and respond to our calls. So just listening to a few of those, what is your reaction? What is your response to this set of rules? What do you think about them? Not everyone has a phone, for sure, for sure. Don't be shy. I know there are a lot of folks in here, more folks than, okay. The ridiculous demands, they're too rigid. But so what happens a lot of times when folks are interacting with folks who are experiencing poverty, whether they're educators or social service workers, sometimes we focus more on controlling behavior and making people compliant. And a lot of times that's what the focus is. We had a conversation with a funder a few months ago, and one of the funders on our call kept asking us about, so at Seeds of Literacy, we have 12 class sessions during the week, and students are free to come to whatever class sessions fit around their schedule. So if they come one week, I'm sorry, I'm not watching this waiting room. If they come one week at 9 o'clock in the morning and they come the next week at 6 o'clock in the evening, or if they miss a week, we don't give students a hard time about that because they're all working individually anyway. So it doesn't really, I mean, we do try to encourage them to continue attending so that they can get, so that they can accomplish their goals, but we don't beat them up about their attendance. And part of the reason, one of the funders just could not understand that. And she kept saying, well, what about accountability? What about accountability? And it's something about folks who are in the upper middle class and the wealthy group, that they just have this mentality of punishing people who have less means. It's just, it really is kind of crazy, but you can see that in this policy here. So every program has policies and procedures. We all have, you know, because we work with people, we know that there are going to be times, even with our staff, when we're going to have to separate, right? And so we have to have those policies in place because they give us a procedure and a process to follow to do that. But you have to look at those and ask yourself, is the tone respectful? Does it sound like I'm addressing adults who are choosing adult education? Is this how I would want someone to speak to me? Would I be okay being on the receiving end of that? So if the answer, when you look at your own policies, if your answer is no, then you might need to revisit your policies. We have a student handbook at Seeds of Literacy that each student gets when they enroll in our program. And there is a list of policies, but they are general policies that are not directed at the student. They are policies that we ask students, staff, and tutors to follow to just continue to maintain respect for one another. So everyone can have some degree of freedom, but where their freedom stops, where someone else's freedom begins. So if that is something that you have in place, you might want to look at what your policies are in terms of attendance and retention, and see if your policies are reflecting that deficit mentality that you feel like you need to control your students instead of just educating them. So why should adult literacy educators, why should we care about poverty in adult education? Well, the main reason is that our beliefs impact our perceptions, and our perceptions dictate our behaviors. I'll say that again, our beliefs impact our perceptions, and our perceptions dictate our behaviors. So there's tons of research in K-12 education that talks about how teacher bias can impact the kinds of decisions that teachers make with students, whether they decide that a student is going to be suspended for behavior versus getting a verbal warning for behavior. If a student is going to be recommended for special education or not recommended or expelled. If a student is going to be promoted to gifted education or if they're going to be kept in general education. All our biases can really impact all of those decisions, and adult education is no different. So one example is that if we believe in the meritocracy, and someone said earlier that whole idea of picking someone up, pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, that's a meritocracy mentality. And that mentality says that if you try really hard, then you'll be successful and you'll accomplish something. And so when you have that belief, then your perception of anyone who you feel isn't successful based on your standards of success, your perception is that that person didn't try hard enough. Right. And most of us have students who are working 2 or 3 jobs trying to get in, attending class, trying to improve their station in life, and it isn't working. It's not because of a lack of effort, but if you believe that trope, if you believe that idea of meritocracy, and you perceive students as then not giving as much effort, if you perceive them as being lazy, then if they're struggling with something academically, you're more likely to say, well, you're not trying hard enough than you are to say, well, you know what, maybe there's something about my instruction that's not getting through to you. Let me approach this instruction in a different way. So part of it is us having the humility to realize that our way isn't the only way, but also having the respect of our students as people to treat them respectfully and to treat them in ways that we ourselves would want to be treated. So sometimes it's not that the student is lazy, maybe they are trying their best effort and your instruction could use a little fine tuning. So that's the conversation I actually had with a instructor that I supervised about 10 years ago. So we, in our tutor training at Seeds of Literacy, we actually spend quite a bit of time. We do 6 hours of tutor training for our tutors when they come into our program. We spend quite a bit of time talking about teacher disposition to make sure that our tutors understand who our students are and where they come from so that they don't have that deficit mentality when they're working with and approaching and communicating with our students. And so we shared this slide with them. And if you were in my implicit bias session, this is a repeat for you because I talked about that then too. But there's a book called Is Everyone Really Equal? By Sensoy and D'Angelo. And one of the things that they say in the book that I think is really important is that where we locate problems determines our role. So for example, if we feel that poverty and illiteracy are the result of a student not trying enough, not picking themselves up from their bootstraps, if we feel it's their fault, then it's like, well, I don't really feel like I'm responsible for fixing your issue. It's not my fault that you don't have a job or that you're not getting enough pay. It's not my fault that you dropped out of school. So if that's our mentality, then we locate that in the individual. But if we locate this as a social problem, as a societal problem, as a systemic problem, if we locate poverty and illiteracy as something that happens to people, not something that they necessarily bring onto themselves, most folks are born into poverty. If we understand that, then we take on a different role. If we look at the problem, if we locate the problem in the collective, then we have more of a response to participate in addressing that problem. So if a student is struggling with spelling, for example, and a tutor or teacher locates a problem within the student, they may focus on the effort. Whereas if they locate the problem as a part, like if you're struggling with spelling, I understand that systemically, we don't necessarily teach reading and spelling effectively, and that we stop teaching it when after a kid is in the 3rd grade. So if you're looking at that as a collective, if you're looking at the problem as a collective, then you might ask the student to spell a couple words and see what kinds of struggles that they're having, and then use that information to figure out what instructional strategies you should use next. So I can't see, most of you guys are not on camera, so I'm not getting a lot of feedback. So I hope that you all are still with me. Somebody give me a thumbs up in the chat or something. Okay, thank you, Sonia, for being on. I appreciate that very much. All right, Ms. Korn, I appreciate you too. Thank you. So let's talk about what poverty is, just so that we are working with a common definition. And I will say this too, I think it's really important to have, when you're talking about people, to use person first language. And person first language says, I recognize that you are a human first who is experiencing some type of condition. So you're not a poor person, you are a person who is experiencing poverty, or a person who is financially marginalized or economically marginalized. So it's very important that we think about that. Like even with our learners, when people say, oh, do you work with low literacy students? I say, no, I work with students who are working to improve their literacy. So just to be careful about the language that we use, even around poverty. So poverty is a state or condition where a person doesn't have the financial resources to meet their basic needs. And basically it means that housing, food, healthcare are things that, transportation are things that they may not have on a consistent basis due to the scarcity of their resources. And there are actually 4 different types of poverty that we should discuss. So the first type of poverty is that generational poverty. Generational poverty means your parents, your grandparents may not have been property owners. They may not have seen any real benefits from their education. Their education did not give them a good return in terms of creating a sustainable income. They maybe haven't had a lot of promotions because their skill set is limited. So that generational poverty, they're folks who are very, very mobile. So they probably move around a whole lot. So if you see a student, maybe you have several locations and the student goes from one location to another location because they're moving a lot. That happens with folks who are experiencing that generational poverty. They've not known plenty in their lifetimes. So that's generational poverty. Then there's working class poverty. And I think as much as we tend to think our students are not in that, I think a lot of our students are in that working class poverty. And that's the students who are working 2 jobs or a job and a half, trying to make ends meet, and they still don't have enough with everything that they're doing to have everything that they need for themselves and for their families. The working class poverty, I think, is one of the hardest things for Americans to really face, because we do have that meritocracy that, oh, well, if you just work hard enough, you'll get out of, where you are. What's true is most people don't rise beyond the level that their parents were. And so for us to expect that from our students it's a huge expectation and it's unrealistic. So working class poverty, they're focusing on making it through weeks, making it through the week, making it through the month. They're the folks who are living check to check. If they lose a paycheck, they would have dire consequences for that. Americans tend to see this type of poverty as a personal deficiency. There's something wrong with you. If you're working and you're employable, then why aren't you earning more? As if it's by the person's will that they're not. Then there's situational poverty. I'm sorry, there's immigrant poverty. And immigrant poverty is the poverty that comes from being in a new country where you may not speak the language, you may not be fluent and able to read your own language, so you definitely can't read this new language. You've got 6 months from the time you land on American soil to start paying back your resettlement loans, and you're just struggling because you don't understand the culture, you don't understand the language. So there's immigrant poverty, and then the last is situational poverty. And situational poverty is when you may have been living a middle-class lifestyle. Most of your peers are in a middle-class group. You're educated, you're working a job, and something happens that impacts your resources. So a very good example would be just losing your job. Another good example would be having some kind of medical issue. There are going to be a lot of people in this country in 2021 who are experiencing situational poverty because of COVID. There are going to be a lot of people who are coming out of hospitals with enormous hospital bills and no real way to pay them. There are a lot of folks who, lost their employment. So we're going to see a lot of situational poverty in the next year to 2, really to 3 years for our students, because again, sometimes they're the last ones hired and the first ones fired. So we're going to see that situational poverty. The thing about the situational poverty is that if it's someone who's going from a middle-class family to being in a situation of poverty, they still tend to have harsh judgment against folks who are in that persistent poverty, who are in that working class poverty for whatever reason. And they don't, for folks who are in the generational poverty, folks who are in working class poverty, that poverty tends to become a part of their identity. For someone who's in situational poverty, they never take on that poverty identity. And because they don't take on that identity, they don't see themselves as being impoverished, they see themselves as being in a very difficult situation, they don't typically stay there. Okay, so let's talk about let me make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself here. Hang on a second. Oh, there's one thing that I want to do. I want to ask you all, what are some of the consequences of poverty that you see? What are some of the consequences? Exhaustion, poor health, isolation, low self-esteem. You got it. You all know this. No transportation. Yes. So our students have all of these things that they carry with them when they come to our classroom, right? Which sometimes I think when some students will come in and they'll talk to me about everything they're going through, and I'm thinking to myself, why are you here? Why are you in this? I don't think I would be able to cope with it with all the resources that I have. I don't think I could manage some of the things that they're experiencing. So let's talk about the causes of poverty, and there are quite a few, and this is actually really pretty interesting to me. So the first is just history. Land and home ownership. They're the biggest sources and drivers of wealth in this country. And this country was designed to maintain that wealth for the folks who were able to obtain it. Now, mind you, for most of us in this country, we've only had about 150 years where we had access to that, because it wasn't until the 1850s that an unmarried woman could even own land. And from 1839 to 1880, married women began earning individual status from their husbands so they could own land. African Americans weren't even considered citizens until 1865 to 1866. So you have a small portion of the population that were landowners, and there were poor white people who could not afford to own land. And so when people say things like, oh, well, when we're in sessions about race and people say, well, all the white folks in here, their parents were slave owners, like, absolutely not. The majority of them couldn't have afforded it because they couldn't afford that land. So we have this small ruling class of people, just like we do now, where 10% of the people in this country concern 90% of the wealth. That has continued, but that has continued because laws are in place to keep that going. So discrimination and social inequality are another cause. Part of the reason that, just considering income discrimination, gender discrimination, women in 2020 can have just as much education and experience as a man and walk in and still make 30% less. So there are lots of reasons that cause someone to really struggle financially, even if they do have the education and access. If you are also preventing people from having access to resources and opportunity, I mean, we all know that our schools aren't funded equally. School funding laws in Ohio have been ruled unconstitutional for almost 2 decades at this point. We still haven't done anything to change it. So we continue that inequity, so we continue creating more poverty and keeping people from getting out of that generational poverty. Also, a lot of our policies that are in place kind of perpetuate that. And so I think about things like, you know, when I've had students who've been on disability because they were struggling to read. They don't want to get off of disability. They're terrified of getting off of disability. Number one, you're not going to be fired from disability, but you can be fired from a job. Number two, there is a benefits cliff. That is a real issue for a lot of folks who are receiving public assistance. So we may say, well, we really want to move you towards self-sufficiency, but then we put 1,000 barriers in the way to prevent someone from even wanting to do that. There's a disincentive for wanting to get off of public assistance. So I'm going to explain it as this. If a person is living where they're receiving benefits, they may be getting cash benefits, they may be getting food stamps, they may be getting childcare, they have healthcare, all of their needs are being met through this system. As soon as they get a job where they start earning income, they become ineligible for some of those resources. So for a lot of women, especially, and fathers who are custodial parents, the decision is, do I continue working 40 hours a week and then lose my health care and lose my child care, or do I receive the benefits until my kids are old enough to go to school and I can manage that? So until we change those kinds of policies, we're going to make it very difficult for people to survive. Not to mention the fact that our federal minimum wage is still $7.25. It's $8.35, I think, in Ohio. It's $4.35 for tipped workers. So remember that the next time you stiff your waitress, she's only getting $4.35 an hour. Those are all real consequences. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology has a living wage calculator. And in that calculator, what they look at is how much would it take a single mom with one child to be able to live on her own without depending on other people and be able to meet all of her food and shelter and clothing and transportation needs. And what they determined for Ohio is that a single mother with a child would need to make $47,208 a year before taxes. So I'll do the math for you because I know your minds are already going. That's $22 an hour. Okay. Again, our minimum wage is at $7.25 an hour federally, $8.75 for Ohio. The federal poverty level is for a family of 4 is $26,200, meaning that if you're making $26,200 or less, you're eligible for federal assistance. Now, some things like SNAP will give you 150% or 138% of the federal poverty level, but consider that MIT says as a single woman with one child, you need $47,000, and our federal poverty level is at $26,000 for a family of 4. Okay. Then there are things like natural disasters. Think about the folks from Hurricane Katrina. They lost absolutely everything, and they didn't necessarily have the resources in place to rebuild, or their policies had loopholes that kept them from doing it. So there are all kinds of things that keep people from moving ahead, or that pulls them into poverty if they were in the middle class. And again, healthcare costs. The average hospital stay is $10,000. To have a healthy baby without complications is about $3,600. You're in overnight and then you're back out again, right? Think about how many people are in a coma for 3 or 4 weeks with this COVID, who are being intubated for weeks with COVID. So think about what kind of outcomes that's going to create for the people who are around us. So let's look also a little bit at poverty in the US. So 1 out of 5 children in the United States lives below the federal poverty level. And this map shows where the poverty distribution. So the darker the state, the greater the percentage of folks in that state who are experiencing poverty. And I'll tell you just what just occurred to me is like the states that are like Arizona, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, those are the states that my boyfriend says, you know, if they seceded, they wouldn't survive because all of our taxes help provide the services that they need in those areas. So you can see how wealth is distributed throughout the country, or how poverty rather is distributed throughout the country. Based on our last year's data, 88% of the students who come to Seeds of Literacy are below the federal poverty level. Infants who are born into poverty are more likely to have mental disabilities or physical disabilities. kids who grow up in poverty are more likely to miss school because of illness, largely due to malnutrition. So you can imagine that if any of our students are part of that generational poverty, that the reason that some of them are in our programs is because they didn't have the things that they needed when they were kids themselves. So overall, there are 43 million American adults who are living in poverty. At the same time, the PIAC data says that there are 43 million American adults who have low literacy levels. It is no coincidence that those are related, right? None of us are surprised by that information. So there are a couple different frameworks that are in place to help us understand poverty. And probably the most well-known one is the one I absolutely hate the most. And that is Ruby Payne's 1995 framework for understanding poverty. And basically what she did is she broke people down into 3 different groups: the impoverished, the middle class, and wealthy people. So this first column that you see is just the different values, different areas where our values lie. The column next to that is folks in poverty. The middle column is middle class, and the column on the right is wealthy folks. So in terms of possessions, according to her framework, people who are in poverty, their possessions are people. That's what they care about. That's what they value. That's what they have ownership of. Okay, so people are their possessions, which I think is a little bit offensive. For folks in the middle class, we care about things. Okay, and people who are wealthy, they care about one-of-a-kind objects, legacies, and pedigrees. So I guess none of us middle class folks are concerned about legacies at all, right? Money. Folks who are in poverty, money is to be used and spent. Folks who are in the middle class, money is to be managed. Folks who are wealthy, money is to be conserved and invested. Is anybody getting sick yet? Okay, so this framework was troublesome because it broke people into groups. It treated people within each group as though they were exactly the same. So every middle class person has the same values and motivations and et cetera, right? So it describes these hidden rules, and what it did is it just created a lot of, to me, what it created was an excuse for people who didn't really want to help folks in poverty anyway to feel like, well, there's no reason for me to help because this is just who people in poverty are. Okay. So her framework has actually been critiqued by a lot of researchers over the years. And the main reasons for that criticism are that she focuses on a very deficit-based mentality. So first of all, poverty actually is not a culture. Poverty is not a mindset. There are ways of being that people develop when they've been living in poverty as a way to cope, but poverty is a social condition. And those folks are in that social condition because our laws and policies make it difficult for people. If Richard Rothstein wrote a book called The Color of Law, and in his book, he talks about how federal policies in the 40s and 50s were largely responsible for segregating people and denying people of African-American descent from entering certain housing markets or becoming homeowners at all, which meant that there are generations of wealth that weren't accumulated because of those policies and laws, right? So they are in the situation because of what our society allows. Their mindset, the old poverty framework, focuses on fixing people in poverty rather than fixing the conditions that create poverty. So fighting for a fair, livable wage for working people and making sure that people aren't taken advantage of by employers. Looking at how we fund our schools. All of those things are things that are policy related, and they just happen to be the folks who are most impacted by those policies. The old framework treats all people in poverty as a monolith and focuses on the symptoms of poverty rather than the causes. It puts low academic achievement squarely on the shoulders of children, on the mindset and values that they say. It's honestly, I attended a training, I think it was last week, on one of those bridges out of poverty trainings. And we were having a conversation. They had us in small groups brainstorming, and we had to think about what do we think of? What do we think is the routine for a woman who's in poverty, in the middle class? And so people were saying things like, oh, well, she gets up, she bathes herself, she gets her children up, she feeds them, she takes them to school. And I was thinking, I'm sure poor parents are doing exactly the same thing every day. I see them on my way to work, dropping their kids off at school. So why would you think that it would be different for a lower income family than a family that's in the middle class? Why do we think that just the basic functioning is very different? So we put that low academic achievement on values, and we say things like, oh, well, poor people don't really care about their kids' education. That's why they don't come to, you know, parent-teacher conferences. Well, maybe they don't come to parent-teacher conferences because they can't afford to take off from their second job to come to parent-teacher conferences to talk to you for 5 minutes about something you could send them in an email anyway. So we have this framework kind of puts all of the blame on parents and just kind of adds these values to them. It's almost like, so it makes me think of watching National Geographic. You ever watch the National Geographic shows where they see this elephant and the elephant is running across the, you know, the plains, and the elephant stops and does something, and then the narrator tells you what that elephant was thinking? Like, how do you know what the elephant was thinking? That's how we treat people in poverty. We know all the answers. We know why they're motivated. We know what their values are, and it simply isn't true. And this framework reinforces that. They focus on perceived weaknesses instead of strengths. So think about how much you make and how you would function if you made half of that. It makes me think that what we should be doing is thinking about how amazing it is when someone has all of those barriers and they're still able to make it, and they're still able to raise their children, they're still able to participate in adult literacy programming. So if we focus on their strengths instead of the weaknesses that this older framework kind of encourages. One of the things, there was a teacher who went through the poverty framework training, and one of the things that she said is that she felt like there were teachers in her building who just didn't care. It was like, these aren't my kids. They didn't care about the students in the way that you would want someone to care about your child. And that she felt that the folks who went through that training just felt relieved and absolved of responsibility. So like, if my kids aren't learning, it's because of poverty. It's not because of anything that I'm doing or not doing. So I think that it's been kind of flawed, and it's really sad that it's so popular, and that here 15, 20 years later, they're still teaching the same stuff and it isn't benefiting anyone. It also casts parents as part of the problem and ignores the systemic nature of poverty. All right, so there are newer mindsets out there, newer frameworks that focus on equity. So a more equitable approach to working with students who are experiencing poverty is to focus on culturally responsive pedagogy. And so culturally responsive pedagogy, or culturally responsive teaching, it makes us stop and think about deconstructing the narratives that exist about adult literacy learners and people who are experiencing poverty. And what I mean by that is, when you recognize, when you're culturally responsive, you recognize that there are larger systemic forces at work, and that people experiencing those, the results of that, usually have almost no power to change what they're experiencing. They don't have control over employment. They don't have control over a lot of the factors that have them in that situation. So one of the things that we train our tutors is, and actually we say it in our student orientation as well, is that if you are not reading on grade level by the time you're 8, you're not likely to get intervention in American schools. Our schools are just not set up that way. So if you don't have everything that you need for learning by 8, you're just kind of out of luck and stuck. So our school system allows so many students to fall through the cracks that we have to re-narrate that. Our students did not fail at school. Our schools fail lots of students every single year because we continue to socially promote them even when they don't have the skills that they need. And I think the only thing really keeping us from giving them what they need is lack of political will. If we really cared about every kid getting a good education, we would change things so that happened, right? When our policymakers want to give themselves raises, they have no trouble finding the money for that, right? So we're lacking the political will for that. Also, if we focus on the things that students are able to accomplish despite their barriers, and focus on reducing barriers and addressing the causes of poverty, that is the mindset that we want to take. So I have some tips here for all of you. I have 15 of them. And if you have, like, if you're, I'm kind of watching the chat, so if you want to comment on any of those, or if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. So the first one is, these are all things that you can do differently. So I say, number one, raise the bar higher for our students. Set high expectations for them, because students are often able to rise to the expectations that you set for them. When you believe that they can do something, it makes it a lot easier for them to believe they can do something. Conversely, if you don't think they can do it, they'll pick that up too. They'll internalize that as well. And so set high expectations for your students. The second is to focus on the assets. What are the things that students are able to do well? And sometimes I'll ask students about the things that they're able to do well and try to incorporate that in conversations that I'm having with them or during instruction. What are the things that you do well? Let's focus on the things that you do well. I also try to get our tutors to think about the fact that the majority of tutors who come through our training will say, well, Carmen, you know, I don't do math. I don't want to do the math, right? So think about this. Most, and if you honestly, if you survey your friends, or actually if you're on Facebook and you see any of those math challenges, you probably know that most Americans don't do math, right? So if you think about moving through this world, if you had to solve a math problem to do everything that you need reading to do, where would many of us be, right? So you have to read information to get into a doctor's office. If you had to solve math to get into that office, what would that be like, right? So our students' experiences with that would be the same. They experience that every day. And so I try to think of like, that's a way for me to feel what it feels like for the students. So if I focus on what they do well and not on the things that they don't do well, it kind of changes their perception and their perspective as well. Provide curriculum mirrors. And what I mean by that is students should see themselves reflected in the materials that we use in our classes. Often they do not, particularly if you're only relying on what the adult education publishers provide, because a lot of that is the stuff that's in the public domain, and that was not culturally reflective at all. So consider that. Getting to know your students, understanding the students' families and understanding the communities, I think can be very, very important. And I think one way to do that is to have students represented throughout your organization. So for example, we have a student leadership group on our team, and we have student ambassadors at our site, and our student ambassadors and our student leadership team help us make decisions about our programming. They help to shape the programming. Their voices are valued and privileged. We take the expertise that they have, those assets, and we combine it with our knowledge of adult education, and we try to create something better for the students and for our program. So getting to know your students on a personal level can kind of help you understand them a little bit better, but also keeps them from being a caricature of poverty. It keeps them from being a stereotype. It helps you to see, you know, how exceptional they actually are. Create space for students to share their backstories. Give them time to share the things that have gone on with their lives. Sometimes those conversations can help you develop a real appreciation for where they've been and what all they've gone through, and the things that they've been able to accomplish despite the incredible barriers that they have. Our program starts at 9 o'clock, but we have students who will show up at 8. And since I'm there super early, a lot of times I'll just kind of wander into my office and I'll sit down and they'll just start talking about all kinds of things that you just couldn't imagine that they've, you know, experienced and have accomplished. And their stories are so incredible. And sometimes we use their stories to encourage other students to attend the program. But once you understand their stories and you understand some of those barriers, it may make it a lot harder to maintain that deficit mentality towards your students. And then really think about accentuating the positive. So if a student says, well, you know, I'm not good at math, you know what, you can get better at math, but you are really great at reading, or like focus on what it is that they do well and just kind of keep reminding them of that, because so often their story has not been one of success. So often they've only heard about the negative things that they've heard, particularly from people in education, that it's nice for them to hear that. And I did a reading assessment for a student the other day who has a stutter, and he was really nervous about doing an oral reading assessment. And I said, oh my gosh, you read beautifully. And he said, no one has ever told me that in my entire life. No one has ever said that. So focus on their assets, their strengths. I think one of the hardest ones is this next one, and that is looking in the mirror and examining your own power and your own privilege and your own bias. I think that one is the most difficult for us to do because it's really hard to see our own bias. But I think a good barometer for that, because the stereotypes in our country are so embedded in our psyche that we make so many assumptions. I'll share a real quick story. I was in New Orleans presenting research at a conference. And, you know, when you're walking through New Orleans, you see people kind of passed out on the street from whatever happened the night before. It's not uncommon to walk past people who are just either panhandling or just kind of passed out. And so we were walking down the street. It was a couple of other doctoral students and me and our professor. And we walked past this man, and our professor turned back around and said, "Are you okay?" And I think we just, because we saw so many people who were panhandling, that we just kind of put our blinders on and just walked past everyone. This man was having a diabetic issue, like he really needed medical care. And because of our blinders, we were going to walk right past him. He could have been in real peril had she not stopped to actually look at him, to actually notice this person. So we have to examine our own biases. I would never have thought, like, you know, I've always been the person to have a couple dollars in my pockets. If I walk past someone, I've got it or whatever. I would never have thought of myself as someone who might walk past a person who's in need. And here I was in New Orleans doing the tourist thing and totally ignoring this man. So we have to examine our own power. We have to examine our own bias, and we have to examine our own privilege and realize that number one, we didn't earn the things that we've earned because of our bootstraps. We earned the things that we've earned because our parents were in a position to provide it. Not that that our own effort hasn't accomplished things for us, but no one is self-made. No one is self-made. So we have to examine those and open our minds to new interpretations of folks who are struggling to meet their basic needs. Second, suspend judgment. It's very easy to dismiss that. And I can give another example of this. I was with the same professor, actually on my way to Toronto. And we were driving through Cleveland, and there was this vehicle underneath the traffic light in the middle of the intersection. It was like 4 o'clock in the morning, so there weren't a lot of cars out. And I just asked my professor, you know, can you stop and see what's going on with this guy? Because why is he in the middle of the intersection? So as we drove up, he was actually kind of like not conscious in his car. So we called the police so that they could send EMS. And I know that when you are in a profession, you get used to seeing certain things. They become old hat to you, right? So these paramedics responded to this man, and I'm thinking that the guy maybe had a seizure or something, or a heart attack. They came into the car, they tried to get his door, they're banging on the car, screaming at the man. They get the car door open, they're rifling through his pockets to see if he has drugs on him. I mean, it was absolutely not the response that I would expect for helpers. I would expect police to do something that wasn't necessarily appropriate, but I wouldn't have expected EMS to respond that way. I was absolutely appalled. They did not suspend judgment. They made the assumption that this man must have been on heroin, and they just kind of got to action based on that. So that belief impacted their perception, and their perception completely dictated their actions. So we have to be careful about that for ourselves and suspend judgment. If a student didn't show up for class, or we're reassessing our students right now, and so many of them are missing their appointments. It's so easy to be like, well, they just don't care. It's so easy to say, well, they just forgot, or they don't keep track of time, or they don't. It's so easy to do that. And maybe they're not coming because they've had a positive COVID test and they need to quarantine. Maybe they're not coming because their transportation didn't show up. You know, there are lots of reasons. So try to get into the habit of suspending judgment and then talking to a student and figuring out what's really going on. Sometimes you get snowed, but what's the worst that's going to happen in an adult literacy program if you get snowed? You extend grace to somebody who didn't deserve it, right? And what kind of consequence is that? It's really inconsequential. So think about that. When people are really struggling, the more support they have, it builds their resilience. So be a part of your student support system. Be one of their cheerleaders. Be a safe space for them. Be a space where they know they can go to get affirmation and assistance, or at least a sympathetic ear. So think about being a part of that network to help build the students' resilience. Do any of these sound like things that you all can do? They don't cost anything so far, right? Everything was free. Have discussions with your students about power, privilege, and bias. They know it exists. They don't necessarily have the language, the academic language that we use, but they see it and they know it, right? So discuss it. If you see, I think the things that happen in the news are such rich material for class discussions around social studies and even healthcare, especially now with the virus. So discuss how power, privilege, and bias play, because sometimes those students have been hearing the same messages we hear about meritocracy, and they've been hearing the same pick yourself up from your bootstraps. And maybe it would help them if you explain to them that you don't have bootstraps. You didn't, that whole analogy doesn't work for you because you didn't have this to begin with. So begin discussing that with them. And again, focusing on just that resilience. Also, Students often have a lot of what students struggle with reading has to do with their background knowledge and how much they understand. And so if you know that students probably haven't had a chance to do a lot of traveling, if you know that they haven't experienced a lot of things, open that world to them, bring the world into your classroom, whether that's by video or whether it's by, bringing in artifacts, or whether it's bringing in speakers, whether it's bringing in, something from your tree or a flower outside that you can discuss for a science lesson. Bring the world to them if they can't go out into the world, to help them build that background knowledge so that when they are reading something, they have something to connect that reading to. That could be a whole other OA session. So I won't go there too far. Leverage your social capital for your students. There is an organization in Cleveland. It's actually a national organization, but in Cleveland, they have a group. It's called Open Table. And the whole concept of Open Table is that some of us have resources that we could leverage for the benefit of someone who is less fortunate. And so what Open Table does is they do a training of volunteers, kind of similar to what you're going through today. And that training of volunteers is really meant to help people learn how to help someone empathically without taking their agency, right? And so what they do is they find 8 volunteers, and that 8 volunteers becomes a friend to a person or a family who needs help. And so for a year, that those 8 people meet with that person, their friend, once a month, and they problem solve. Like, well, what are you trying to find an employment? You need help with a resume? Oh, I can write, I can help you with your resume. Oh, I've got a friend who does mock interviews at their agency, or here's an organization. So you connect them to resources in the community that might not be in their social capital, might not be in their fund of resources. So using your capital to help other students. I did this myself recently with Seeds. We do reading assessments for all of our students who come into our program. And I needed more tutors who are willing to do that. So I actually just posted on Facebook, I need people to help me assess my students. Who's willing to learn how to do this training? And people showed up. And so they help us with that part of the assessment. And our students are able to learn some information about themselves as readers that they can take into their tutoring sessions in our program. And also connecting students. We have a student who is really struggling with reading and really in need of employment. And so I used a relationship with an employment agency to say, listen, I have a student who doesn't meet your qualifications, but I will help him with anything that he needs to read so that he can go through your program because he needs this job. If I need to sit through orientation with him, I will do it. If you can come and do orientation at our site, I will host it. Whatever I can do, so use your social capital to help your students where you can. That doesn't mean that you solve their problems for them, but you bring in resources that might not be readily at their disposal. A second thing, which is a part of that, is making warm transfers. And by warm transfers, I mean, if I know, Miss Pryor Williams. Okay, so let's say Miss Pryor Williams is, great at resume writing, for example. If I have a student who needs that service, I'm not going to just give them her business card and say, well, call this lady. I know that she does resumes, or go to her agency. This is what they do. I'm going to call you while that student is in my office and say, I have a student who needs your services. Do you mind talking to her for a few minutes, and make that connection person to person instead of handing them a business card or a flyer about some resource that they may never follow up on. And throughout Ohio, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but there's a service in Ohio, a network called Unite Us. If you're not, you might want to Google Unite Ohio, I think is what it'll come up as. But basically, it's a referral service. So if I have a student who's looking for housing repair assistance, I can put her into this Unite Us portal. And if there's anyone in the state who does that, they'll get a notice, and then they can follow up on that referral. So just kind of think about ways to try to connect students to resources that they may not necessarily have access to. And also in ways that helps them to avoid some of the red tape. So we have a program where we help students make contact with one of the TRIO programs, Educational Opportunity Center. And what we do is we help students make sure they have all the paperwork they need before they go to that appointment, so that they don't go all the way downtown for the appointment and find out, oh, well, you needed your last 2 years of W-2s, or I don't have your GED transcript. We try to make sure they have everything they need, or make a phone call before to see, does my student even qualify for your program before you send them to them? So making those warm transfers. And then avoid faulty attribution. So faulty attribution is excuse me, faulty attribution is when we say, when we attribute motives to someone's behavior because we don't necessarily have an explanation for it, right? So that's the folks who say, oh, well, you know, I teach at a low income school and none of my parents came to my program, so they must not care about their kids' education. No, maybe they have 3 other kids and you didn't provide childcare, you know, so we tend to kind of assign these motives that may not be their motives at all. I was at a family engagement event once, and this woman was saying, you know, well, I don't understand why. Well, first of all, it was a parent engagement summit. There was not a single parent in the room who was not employed by one of the participating agencies. And she said, well, if students don't show, you know, if the parents don't come to my program, it just seems to me like if you could spend 2 hours to go get your hair done, then you can come to my program. And I was like, what? So what kind of mindset is that? So just really trying to, you know, kind of build, even within your agency, this awareness of where bias exists and to try to identify it and to get to the point where you call it out on a regular basis and not call it out in a confrontational way, but to say that you know, this is something that I noticed and something that I recognize. And is this the interpretation? Are we assigning a faulty assumption? Are we making faulty attribution? Or are we, or is this accurate? It's like to really start examining your policies and practices to see, would you be one of your students? Would you be willing to go through the hoops that you have to jump through? The TABE aside, would you want to be one of your students? That's really kind of a question that can help center those conversations. So are there any questions? I did see someone, Teresa. Thank you, Teresa. Teresa, you're like one of my favorite people. She searched Unite Ohio and got Unite Ohio as a coordinated care network of health and social care providers. And that's exactly what it is. They have a process for you becoming an agency. They have a 72-hour turnaround window. So if you get a referral, you have to respond within 72 hours. And it really is meant to be kind of a coordinated care network throughout the state. I know that they're in Ohio with Metro Health Hospital. I'm not sure if the other hospital systems in Ohio are going to join it or not. Are there any questions before we close? All right. Well, then, thank you all so much for coming to this session. I appreciate that so many people were interested in it, and hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you so much.